Simonetta Vespucci was a noblewoman born in Genoa in 1453. Both her father and mother were part of very illustrious families, and the Cataneo name is one of the oldest family names in Genoa. But despite all that, her family was exiled for political reasons at one point, so they left to one of their villas in Piombino. Piombino is a small Tuscan town that sits right on the west coast of Italy. One day, while attending church with her parents, 15-year-old Simonetta met her future husband, Marco Vespucci. The Vespucci family was a very wealthy family from Florence and were in Piombino as guests of Duke Jacopo III, who also happened to be Simonetta's brother-in-law. He was married to her half-sister from her father's first marriage. Marco had often visited the small town at the request of his father to study business and laws. So you're probably familiar with the Vespucci name from Amerigo Vespucci. He was a Florentine navigator and explorer from whose name the term America is derived, after he took several voyages to the New World. Well, Marco's father, Piero Vespucci, was Amerigo's cousin. After Marco met Simonetta, he quickly fell in love with her and their marriage was arranged. Her parents were happy to have him as her husband since he came from a very well off family with great ties in Florence. So, of course, her father quickly agreed to the union. 16-year-old Simonetta married Marco Vespucci in 1469 at a church in Genoa. As you can imagine, it was a grand affair attended by pretty much all the nobility in northern Italy. So, almost immediately after the wedding, the newly wedded couple made their way to Florence to start their life together. They easily and quickly became part of the Florentine court life, which is the circle in which the nobles and upper class ran in. And of course, this was no problem for them due to their family name and wealth. And her husband, Marco, was also a banker and had close ties with the Medici banking family, which was a very important family in Florence. Now, this was the time in Florence where Lorenzo de' Medici, also known as Lorenzo the Magnificent, and his brother Giuliano were coming into power. Lorenzo ran the Medici family bank and was heavily involved in the politics of Florence. Well, one day, Lorenzo invited the couple to a party at his villa where all of the who's who of Florence was in attendance. I could imagine a Medici party was not one to be missed, and this is when her beauty began to catch many people's attention. You can imagine being new in town is already enough to get people talking, but being as beautiful as Simonetta was said to have been, it really made her the center of attention. Although it wasn't just her beauty, she was also said to have been very kind and gentle and a woman of great virtue. So, of course, her beauty caught the attention of many of the artists in Florence at that time, including the great Sandro Botticelli, who was close to the Medici family. Sandro and Simonetta actually lived in the same neighborhood. They may possibly have even been very close neighbors, and with them living so close to each other, they were bound to run into each other pretty often. So maybe this is how Botticelli became so attracted to her beauty by bumping into her in the streets of Florence. On January 29th, 1475, a jousting tournament was held in Florence. The event was held to celebrate the alliance between Florence, Milan, and Venice, and was in a way a symbol of the Medici family, in particular Lorenzo, coming into power. The tournament was a pretty big deal at that time, and even years later was written about in a poem by Florentine scholar Angelo Poliziano. So, Giuliano de Medici entered this jousting tournament and dedicated it to Simonetta. Now, Giuliano was not married, and although Simonetta was, it was common for knights in jousting tournaments to dedicate their performances to noble women and women of high ranking. This was known as courtly love. Courtly love had a code of conduct they honored, such as duty, honor, courtesy, and bravery, and it was more for the knight to show his loyalty and devotion to his lady, just as he would to his lord. Now, it's safe to say that Giuliano probably had other intentions, perhaps, given his status within Florence. So, in these instances of courtly love with a knight, the lady would often give the knight a token of affection for good luck, which would include things like a scarf or some type of fabric that would include her coat of arms. And it would often be scented with her favorite fragrance. The tournament was held at Santa Croce Square, And Giuliano, who was close friends with Botticelli, had him paint his processional banner. Botticelli painted the Roman goddess Minerva in arms, along with a cupid beside her, and with a French motto, the unrivaled one, written underneath. Botticelli gave Minerva the face of Simonetta. Whether it was at the request of Giuliano or if it was Botticelli's idea, we'll never really know, but it was no longer a secret that Giuliano believed Simonetta to be the most beautiful woman at the tournament and all of Florence. Now imagine Giuliano riding in on his horse with a beautifully painted Simonetta on his banner as trumpets play in the background, him wearing his armor and fighting for her love and attention. Well, Giuliano won that tournament that day, and some believe that from this moment on, Giuliano and Simonetta began a romantic relationship, eventually falling in love. Up to this point in time, however, it has never actually been proven that they were lovers. But there are many reasons to believe this theory, with there being so many written documents connecting her as Giuliano's beloved. If they did have a romantic relationship, it did not last very long. The next year after the tournament, Simonetta fell ill. She was sick for about a month straight with what they believed to be tuberculosis. Lorenzo, while away in Pisa, even provided a doctor to look after her. This may have been at the request of Giuliano, or maybe Lorenzo felt the need to help out the most beautiful woman in Florence for whatever reason. Unfortunately, she never recovered from her illness, and on April 26, 1476, Simonetta passed away at the age of 22, and many in Florence mourned her passing. For her funeral, her body was carried from her home to the Ognissanti church where the Vespucci family are buried. She was carried in an open casket so that all the mourners could catch a glimpse of her beauty one last time. A number of poets in the city wrote eulogies and epitaphs, Lorenzo being one of those who wrote 4 sonnets upon her death. Lorenzo is known to have written many poems throughout his life, so this was not surprising, especially with the Vespuccis and the Medici having a close connection and supposedly being allies. He also wrote this: all the Florentines of talent, as was fitting in such a public bereavement, variously expressed their grief, some in verse and some in prose, about the bitterness of this death. And each attempted to praise her according to his own ability. And I wish to be among them and to accompany their tears with the sonnets which follow. This really gives you an insight into how her death was a big deal to the people of Florence, or at least to the people who knew her. Now, we can't forget about Giuliano. He was said to be devastated by her death, and there's even a portrait of Giuliano painted by Botticelli between 1478 and 1480 that includes a turtle dove in the corner of the painting. This was a symbol of loyalty to the beloved on the part of a mourner. Giuliano actually died 2 years later to the day at the age of 24. He was assassinated in the Pazzi conspiracy, which is a whole other story in itself. But we get a look into his grief through letters written after his death in 1478 between Simonetta's father-in-law and Giuliano's mother. Her father-in-law writes, when the blessed soul that was your Giuliano used to visit my house, he said to me many times in the presence of Niccolò Martelli that he was the unhappiest young man not only in Florence, but in all Italy. I had such pity for him. He aroused such sorrow that to make him happy and give me pleasure, both my son Marco and I did all we could to please him, as his kindness, correctness, and gentle breeding deserved. We gave him all of Simonetta's garments and her portrait. Marco and I did this all with affection. He aided us with money and in every way he could. And that's really interesting to know that Giuliano ended up with all of Simonetta's garments to help him get through his mourning, if he was ever able to get through it at all. Many artists paid tribute to Simonetta after her death, one of those being Piero di Cosimo. One of his most famous paintings, a painting of a lady, was painted in 1490. This portrait is said to be of Simonetta. She's shown in profile with her hair in elaborate braids decorated with pearls. She wears a necklace, and around the necklace there is a snake wrapped around it. The painting even includes her name, and it's the only painting of hers that includes her name on it, although it may have been added sometime after the portrait was painted. We also have Sandro Botticelli, another man and artist that was clearly captivated by her beauty. Botticelli paid tribute to her through much of his art. Some of the most famous paintings linked to Simonetta are painted by him. Although the only surviving paintings we have from him that use her likeness are ones painted after her death. Like Primavera was painted in the very early 1480s. Mars and Venus, which has been said includes Giuliano as a model for Mars, was painted around 1483. And then you have The Birth of Venus, which is probably the most famous painting of his that uses her face, being painted in 1485. And if you look to some of his other works, you may even see a resemblance in the different women's faces he painted. So he definitely used her face as inspiration often. Unfortunately, we have no existing paintings of her by Botticelli from when she was alive. There surely had to have been, but we have to remember that in 1497 in Florence, there was the bonfire of the vanities that took place. And on this day, many people who were followers of Friar Savonarola burned thousands of items. Everything from books, art, instruments, clothing, jewelry, and even cosmetics. So just imagine what all was lost in that event. And Botticelli was a follower of his, so perhaps he himself burned some of his own artwork. If these really were representations of her, it's clear she left a lasting impression on many Florentine artists for many years after her passing. So much so that Sandro Botticelli left a request that when he passed, he wanted to be buried at her feet. 34 years later, when he passed away in 1510, his request was granted. Botticelli was buried in the church of Ognissanti at the feet of his supposed muse. This was also the church of Botticelli since he lived in the same neighborhood as Simonetta, and he was even baptized there. You can visit the church of Ognissanti today and see Botticelli's burial spot in a corner next to the chapel where the Vespucci family is buried, along with Simonetta. While there is no marker to show where she's been placed, only her husband's grandfather has a marker. You can get an idea of where she would be by seeing the location of Botticelli's marker. This request to be buried at her feet has made researchers wonder what role Simonetta played in his life. Was she a lover? Was it a platonic relationship? Or was she just his muse? We may never really get the answer. Simonetta Vespucci was loved by many in Florence for not just her beauty, but because of how she carried herself. And whether it really is her in those paintings, one thing is for sure. Her name has been remembered for almost 550 years and will continue to be for years to come. If you want to hear more about the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, you can find me as History by Lynny on Instagram, TikTok, and even Facebook. I would love to see you guys there, and until next time.